Hello guys and welcome back to 6++ and this special video on the state of the singles meta in November 2025. Tom, very lowest of men here, and what I'm going to be doing in this video is drawing together the overall impression of the singles meta at this moment in time. I'm going to try and do one of these every month for singles and teams. And I think I'm going to try and draw my experience from writing for competitive innovations with Goonhammer, where I'm literally reading down the list of everything that's able to place high or win events every single week. So I'm able to kind of track trends and changes as they happen from that. I'm going to sort of package in my observations as a commentator in UKTC, observing the UK scene, some of the biggest events there. And I will, of course, be drawing a little bit of inspiration from the wider content sphere and some of the wonderful stats put out by groups like StatCheck, Meta Monday, other groups elsewhere as well. I'm going to bring you this very distilled, very condensed, very sort of focused, and I'm going to avoid getting too much into the minutiae of the data here today, but I will look at what its overall implications are for you out there in the field playing the game at this moment in time, and what we can be thinking about going forwards as well. Hopefully there'll be useful tips and tricks for you in here, and obviously I'd love and welcome any and all feedback. Okay, let's get started. As far as the structure goes, what I want to do with these every week is every month, is think about an overall meta status. What is the current state of the game? What are we looking at right now? How urgent are things, and how sort of balanced are things? Then I'm going to move to consider some outliers, both our most dominant outliers and why that might be, and how they're winning, and also some of our strugglers, some of our lower down outliers, why they are currently struggling. Then I want to unpack a few rising stars, armies that are actually creeping into a very good position in the game right now in singles, and a few falling stars as well. Ones that have fallen from grace are fading away a little bit. Finally, what I'm going to be trying to do is identify what the dominant meta archetypes approaches to the game are in November 2025. Now, I was looking at this. There is in singles, I would say, one dominant meta archetype right now that is really bossing the field. And I'll return to that at the end and explain a little bit about my thinking as well. So let's move forward to discuss the meta status. I've got good news, guys. It's a balanced meta. Yay, happy times. I think in general, although you have a few armies that are stronger than others at the top of the game, the meta itself is balanced. We're seeing a lot of different armies able to place high. We're seeing a lot of different armies able to win events. We are seeing a small cluster of armies taking a larger chunk of events than the rest, but it is not a level of dominance where they only need to think about each other. It's not a level of dominance where they don't have bad matchups, and it's not a level of dominance where if you're going to singles events, you're only ever going to have to think and worry about one or two things because they're so prevalent and so dominant. So I think in that sense, the last data slate actually did a really good job. We've got a much more diverse field than I think some people were anticipating. I think there was a lot of anticipation of a combat pressure meta. If we look back to LGT in particular, there were a lot of people putting their eggs in armies like World Eaters, Emperor's Children out there in the singles scene. And actually, that's shaked out very differently. And the overall game has ended up a lot more balanced, and a completely different archetype has ended up on top. So we'll get to that shortly. So the good news is we don't need urgent, massive changes. There are certainly armies that do need some love one way or the other. And there are adjustments that I'm sure we will see made in the future. But actually, you're not looking at a meta that's completely lost the plot, and you're not looking at one where good players can't win games into any faction. There are lots and lots of possibilities for you out there right now. So that's a good place to start this series. Long may that continue. Okay, moving it forward. Let's think about our outliers, because there are some outliers. Okay, there are a few armies who are a little bit better than others right now. The three that immediately jump out to me are Adeptus Mechanicus, Eldari, and Adeptus Sororitas. Now, these have been performing very well at events with lots of top placings, lots of event wins, actually a multitude of builds for all three of these armies as well. So they're in a strong position because multiple different detachments are working for these armies. And on a data sense, they are performing a little over where we like armies to be, a little bit north of and in and around the sort of mid-50s win rate percentage. Now, I don't put too much stock in win rate, but nonetheless, we can see they're doing well at that sense, and they're doing well in terms of how the winning positions they're in to get to the end of tournaments and other things as well. I think these armies all have very powerful things to draw on right now in sense of their basic fundamental rules, right? The Adeptus Mechanicus got some big buffs recently, which essentially gave them Oaths of Moment on top of the other army rules they already had. That was a huge output boost to the Adeptus Mechanicus, which already had a massive mission play toolkit, lots of bodies on the board, lots of speed and reach, particularly if you play Halo Screed Battleclade, but also the ability to have a horde of army-wide stealth with Hunter Cohort, and the sort of mortal wound shower of Radzone. We've seen a number of different builds succeeding for AdMech. I think Hunter Cohort and Halo Screed being the most consistently successful. But AdMech lists can now field lots and lots of Infiltrators and Rust Stalkers, Infiltrators having recently been buffed as well. So lots of speedy forward pressure units, Taraxi for blocking and harassment, the Iron Strider chickens for range support, and then breaches as well behind that. So there's a lot of different ways you can slice it, but the basic AdMech list boils down to it has a lot of stuff, it can body you on the mission, and it also now has very, very boosted output. So that puts AdMech in a really strong position here. We've seen armies like Guard in the past occupied with this position, where if you can be the one with the lots of stuff that also shoots hardest, that puts you in a really strong spot. And I think AdMech is probably the most dominant of those types of armies right now, though there are a couple of others that are worth thinking about in the Rising Stars section. Also in Outliers is Eldari. Now, Eldari are a little bit different to the other armies we're listing here because they are quite a low model count elite army, but what they absolutely do pack is the ability to launch incredible alpha and beta strikes in game right now. That's via the aspect host detachment primarily, but we're also seeing similar things being done in war hosts. So both these detachments do a lot of damage through non-interactive shooting, so getting something like a brick of fire dragons out, destroying a load of enemy units, getting back in a transport, and then doing it again until they're dead. Right, it's a difficult style to interact with for certain kinds of armies. Particularly, ranged armies find this quite difficult. Things that can't get into the terrain and dig the Eldar out struggle with this. And actually, what we're seeing, and this is something I'm going to come back to, is that the kinds of armies that Eldar struggle with, which is mostly aggressive pressure, are actually not getting to the top of the current scene and current field right now, which is allowing Eldar to slip by a little bit unscathed despite having bad matchups out there in the field. I think the power of the Eldar Alpha or Beta Strike, the ability to launch all of your aspects into one portion of the board and do huge damage, means that even in their worst matchups, they do have the option of digging themselves out. And it is interesting to see that Eldari has clustered almost completely around Aspect Host and War Host right now. So it is that non-interactive strike shooting out of transports that's doing a lot of work for the Eldari and Aspect Warriors in particular. So they are in a very strong spot as well. And finally, the most recent arrival to our outliers is the Adeptus Sororitas, who are also performing well in terms of top placings and event wins. We're seeing lots and lots of different types of detachment do well for Sisters. So Champions of Faith has been doing well. Hallowed Martyrs has been doing well. Bringers of Flame has been doing well. Obviously, Jack Tite's win at Coventry, the most recent example of that as well. So I think there is evidence here that the various small buffs applied to the Adeptus Sororitas over recent times. It's worth saying of our three here, Eldar took small nerfs, but the others took buffs in recent times in terms of balance adjustment. For the Adeptus Sororitas, they have integrated the Sanctifiers, a kill team with a bunch of flamers and a scout move, into their game plan, which gives them nice early offense that they were sometimes lacking. They've obviously got buffs to the Retributors, so they now have a wider range of anti-elite and anti-heavy shooting in the army. You're not just as dependent on Val to do the heavy lifting. And of course, they have Miracle Dice access and everything else as well. So basically a series of small buffs, and the meta shifting around them has brought Sisters up into a really nice spot where they're performing very, very consistently, able to go toe-to-toe with quite a wide range of armies, packing, especially in these Bringers lists, packing really good reach and shooting in the list building around Sacrosanct bricks, having a nice durable anvil to draw people out on. There's actually a whole bunch of styles working for Sisters. This was obviously a very powerful book from its release. It's the same for Eldar. I think both these books just had a really good baseline of powerful rules and units to draw on. Sisters have had a few of their edges rounded out now. The Eldari have found the latest version that works in the meta that they're in, and the AdMech have sort of been brought to the party by being given additional buffs and rules several times over several slates until they finally arrive at being a very effective meta force. So these three armies, I think, are the most dominant in the singles scene right now, but there's a whole bunch of different things working. Every single one of them does lose games and does have bad matchups, and they all have very spicy games into one another as well, which always keeps things a little bit more balanced up the top of the game as well. So fantastic to see these armies performing well. And I say, if there's any that are going to get any kind of targeted adjustments in the future, it may well be these three. But I think we are in a state of balance where adjustments in any direction can have massive implications and effects. So we don't need to be looking to treat anything too crazily or aggressively here. If we move it to think about our strugglers and our outlying strugglers, the good news here again is that actually every army pretty much is within the balance window. So if you're looking at win rates, you're not going to see anything egregious here. There's no armies who are doing like absolutely bottoming out below the 40s, anything like that. What you will see is that there are armies that are much less capable of putting up good runs at events, getting up into the top placings and everything else. So I'm going to pick out a few of them here, but there were several others as well. Drukhari, I think, are the most interesting of the ones that jumped out to me on the stats I was looking through, because Drukhari obviously got their new codex very recently. I've published on that on our channel my thoughts on it, and I am a little bit concerned about the book and about the army, how it's landing, because I think Drukhari are struggling. I think players are still struggling to adapt to the new playstyle, to the loss of certain units, to the fact that they're a very fragile army that isn't actually as fast as some of its predators out there in the wider game right now, and is struggling to get its teeth into especially those top armies. Right, Drukhari does not have good game into Sisters, Admech, or Eldar, which makes this a very hostile meta for the book to be dropping into. I think probably it's going to take a bit of time to adapt. We saw good runs for Spectacle of Spite at the World Championships, and certainly in-house, our feeling is that that's the most powerful detachment with the most powerful tricks. But a lot of people at the moment trying to make Kabalite Cartel and Reaper's Wager work, and it remains to be seen quite where the ceiling is for those sorts of detachments at the moment in the wider scene. I think Drukhari may need a little bit of love in the future, some adjustments here and there on the point side of things, but it's going to be interesting to see how that book gets on. We've also got Space Wolves struggling down in a similar region as well. 40s kind of win rate, not massive representation at the top tables, dropping off quite a lot. I think this is probably partly the Marine effect, where if you're not the most appealing Marine option at a moment in time, which right now is arguably Black Templars or Raven Guard, then you don't see as much use, at which point the much larger player base of Marines and the sort of dedicated fan base of particular factions, who are often a bit more casual in approach, can drag you down a little bit. The Space Wars book landed in a fairly solid place. It was good. It wasn't massively shining or devastating. There were obviously some nerfs to the Iron Priest over time as well, which cut off some of the shooting output in that book. And I think the Space Wolves have probably just suffered a slight degree of abandonment, and are just out there as a Marine option in a field where there simply are better, more flexible Marine options. But it is interesting to see them there, and it does beg the question. I think it's because the Space Wars book itself, the detachments from that book haven't seen massive use. We've seen some use of Beast Slayer, but actually a lot of the time Space Wolves have been played in Gladius or Stormlance. I do wonder if maybe the way to get Space Wolves back in the game is to apply a few interesting adjustments and buffs to their Space Wolf specific detachments. Finally, we also have Imperial Knights down here as well. Now, Imperial Knights are in an interesting spot where they had a very powerful summer. They then copped a bunch of nerfs, which were then applied to their new book. And the new book invoked something of a moral panic before it actually hit the wider scene, and was then adjusted and nerfed quite heavily. So Imperial Knights, I think, are casting about a little bit for an identity right now. There seems to be a number of builds you can do with lots of armages or with centered around the big knights, but it is definitely struggling to hold it up, and has landed in more of a gatekeeper role, where it's struggling to reach the latter rounds of events consistently and struggling to be as impactful as it previously was. And it's interesting because Chaos Knights have skirted through their nerfs a lot better, and they've done so by drawing partly on the Carnivore datasheet, which Imperial Knights have no equivalent of, and partly on things like Beasts of Nurgle and Plague Bearers and Nurglings to cover up the gaps. Imperial Knights don't have quite the same suite of options to call upon to cover up the gaps and help get the efficiencies out of their datasheets, and they don't have the double Gatling despoiler datasheet to draw upon like the Chaos Knights do either. So they're in a bit of a rough spot here by comparison, and perhaps are going to need a little bit of a look at an adjustment to try and bring that book back to life. Because again, 2 new books here struggling in the field, I think is really interesting. There would have been a time where new releases dominated everything when they came out, and that's how I've understood the game for a very long time. What I think is both good and interesting and challenging is that adjustments made in data slates to armies that are already well established are putting them at the top, but actually new books are being quite carefully treated and are struggling to compete, and may need a little bit of adjustment to bring themselves to life and get them in the game in the future as well. So those are some of our notable strugglers here, and armies that perhaps need a little bit of a look in the future. Moving it forwards, we have a whole bunch of rising stars. There's a lot of armies lurking just under the top there that I think all have massive potential and have all been performing particularly well in singles. So the Tau Empire, I think, bears massive consideration. Tau have been performing very well across events. They have had almost all of their detachments achieving good runs, top placings, finals, some wins as well. Montcar is, I guess, the weapon of choice, the most dominant detachment right now, but I think Retaliation Cadre is also very good. We've still seen some occasional runs from Auxiliary Cadre and the Recruit Hunting Pack as well. So Tau in a very strong position. They match the archetype that I think is doing the best in the meta, but we'll come to that a little bit later. What they certainly have is some recently buffed units, a lot of stuff, and a very good mission play toolkit, as well as some excellent rain damage. Good parallels between them and Admech there, and I think both those armies are succeeding for similar reasons right now. It's also worth considering Chaos Demons, right? I think Chaos Demons are in an interesting spot where they've just kept being good the whole way through recent times. Demonic Incursion continues to put up very good results. Shadow Legion is a more specialized rush list that likes elves and shooting armies, but is actually very good because there's plenty of those in the meta right now, and it's performing very consistently too. And we've seen some interesting little pop-ups for Plague Legion and Scintillating Legion as well. Sadly, not too much for Slaanesh or Khorne, but they do still occasionally put runs together. I think Demons have that stat check, have that guile, have that trickery, have a nice mix of tools in their favour, and they too have obviously enjoyed a series of buffs over the last 6 months in different ways that have brought certain data sheets up. Scarbrand is a massive asset in incursion lists, and Chaos Demons, I think, sit in a really strong position. And it helps that they have quite decisive game into things like Eldari, which is obviously one of the top meta forces at the moment. Another interesting one is Deathwatch. Deathwatch are consistently putting up good runs in the running to win events, up in the top placings, performing well above their weight on win rate as well. They're obviously a bit more specialized and competing in some ways with Raven Guard in that kind of going to go and be a sneaky shooting marine list. But I think Deathwatch's stats and data and positioning is actually a lot better than certainly myself and other commentators thought it was going to be. It's not an easy detachment to use well, Deathwatch, and it definitely has some fail cases. But again, I think probably a little bit like Demons, it's thriving in a meta that has plenty of fragile elves in the New Drukhari and the Eldari to hunt, plenty of Xenos out there to be fighting, and armies where it can apply its damage a little bit at a time and pick them off. It seems to be enjoying. So these are three armies that I may well expect to see thrive, especially if another slate comes along, bops some of their competitors and leaves them relatively intact. Obviously, Tau do have to weather a slight points nerf to the stealth suits in the recent release. That may hurt them a tiny bit, as stealth suits obviously very central to how Tau play there as well. If we move it over to Falling Stars, we've got a few armies of one army of yesteryear, a new book, and one that I think hasn't quite hit the heights that were anticipated either. So Death Guard is dropping off quite hard, guys. Okay, Death Guard on its data is looking a little bit ropey at this point. It's dropped right down. It's not in any sort of good, strong, consistent winning positions at tournaments. It's not placing high. Virulent Vectorum occasionally pops up. That is about the last bastion of Death Guard's competitive edge right now. And the diversity that we saw on release has really dropped off, which is a bit of a shame. I think it may have been slightly over-nerfed, Death Guard, and it might be a case that it needs to have a little bit of love in the future and be brought back, because it's certainly dropping off pretty aggressively. And I think its basic running weaknesses of being slow and clunky are really suffering into a field that's much more able to take it on at range, because it just doesn't have as much stuff on the board to go toe-to-toe with those kinds of armies now. Another falling star I wanted to highlight is Orcs. I think there was a lot of anticipation the Orcs will be quite strong coming out of this. And I think at an anecdotal level, Orcs are enjoying their games. Orc players are having a good time. The Gazgul brick plugs into a whole bunch of different detachments. We've seen a few breakouts for Warhorde and for Dreadmob, but on the raw data, on the stats, and on the winning position data for tournaments as well, Orcs are not performing particularly exceptionally. They've dropped off a little bit from, I think, where people were expecting them to be. I think this is an army which people are still struggling to find the balance between the ranged and melee elements and exactly which way to utilize the Gaz brick alongside other assets, right? And it's got quite a streaky matrix, I think, into the wider field right now. Another army with a very streaky matrix is the Leagues of Votann, who are in a similar boat, suffering a little bit as far as their representation at the top of the game goes. Fairly bang average win rate that's been dropping off a little bit since the book came out, and essentially centering around one or two detachments now in Needguard or Hearthband primarily, with a few Mavericks exploring the Delve Assault Shift as well. I think Votann are solid, but I think that initial book buzz has worn off, and I think they have been again struggling with an upper field of Eldari, Sisters, and Admech. Those aren't nice matchups for the Votann. That's a tough place for them to be, and I think they are always a little bit prone to suffering in a top meta game where they get outranged and outgunned and outmaneuvered, and that is definitely happening to them at the moment. So Votann dropping down a little bit, going to be interesting to see if players can adapt that and move that forwards. So what's the meta archetype? My assessment is that although we were calling for and expecting a combat pressure meta with Emperor's Children, World Eaters, all that good stuff, Orcs, after the last slate, we've actually moved into a range board control meta. I've been covering this in my observations at UKTC events, in my commentary, in my analysis for the game. Essentially, armies that can play the board, play the primary, have lots of small assets for trading, OC denial, skirmishing, but also have a really good range fire base, are in an exceptionally strong spot right now. So that's armies like Admech, it's armies like Sisters, it is armies like Tau. Astra Militarum is still plugging away and putting up plenty of top placings in a very similar fashion. Those armies are crowding out and getting the edge on combat armies quite a lot of the time right now, in the singles meta in particular. The Chaos Knights build with the triple despoiler also fits into this build as well. Eldari, I think, sit among this because their speed, and Raven Guard, I'd say, fit in a similar boat to this. Although they don't have as many assets to play the game and don't have quite the same go wide board control, they can apply massive damage where they need to, which lets them keep up with those kinds of lots of stuff, shooty, stodgy board control armies. So we are seeing that the Eldari are able to hang in that field. It's why we're seeing success for things like Deathwatch and Raven Guard as well. But what I would say is that the field is looking far more shooting focused in that sense. And the reapplication of range damage into key areas alongside lots of board control and lots of units to play the game seems to be propping up a lot of armies. And our combat meta darlings have definitely settled in as fairly balanced, with some good and bad matchups amongst that. Things like Emperor's Children and World Eaters, both, although very effective armies at what they do, haven't come out in a consistent and dominant place at the top of the singles game, where they have to reckon with a lot of these armies that can kind of absorb their pressure and then roll them back. So I would say at the moment, as we head into Christmas time, we are very much looking at a ranged board control meta. Make of that what you will. It's a good time to be guys with guns, and guys with OC2 stood in front of guys with guns. Thank you very much to listening to this very first 6++ meta analysis. It's been a lot of fun to do. I'm really excited to do these in more depth in the future. Please do leave me a comment. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, anything I can improve on or add in future videos. I'll be trying to cover the team's meta as well every month and make these videos for you going forwards. Please do hit like and subscribe. Leave us a comment. If you want to sign up as a YouTube member and support the channel financially, we're trying to grow and push on this year. It'd be amazing to have your support. If you're interested in getting 40k coaching with myself and the guys, we run a whole bunch of coaching out of our coaching Discord as well. Don't hesitate to get in touch with us via our Discord or via our email. Links in the description below. You all rock. I've been Lowest of Men. I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.